1943. The world is at war. These are Mussolini's soldiers, captured by Allied forces. For them, the fighting is over. What awaits them across an ocean, in the land of the enemy, is an uncertain nightmare. Prison camps, starvation, brutality. They are the enemy. But what they found wasn't hell. Something so utterly transformative that when the war finally ended and the gates swung open, thousands made the most absurd request a POW could make. Please don't send us home. The reason that went down in history sounds like a joke. Here, the food is better. The story begins not in a prison camp, but in the sun-scorched villages of southern Italy. Here, a young man named Giovanni receives a letter that seals his fate. He's no fervent fascist. He's a farmhand who knows more about olive groves than battle lines. But Mussolini's ambition required bodies, and Giovanni's was now property of the state. He, like millions, was a pawn in a game he didn't understand. The army he joined was a hollow shell of the grand Roman Empire Mussolini dreamed of. The equipment was a bad joke. Giovanni was handed a Carcano rifle, a model that was already old during the First World War. His uniform was thin wool, hardly a defense against the blistering heat of Africa or the freezing nights. Morale was a foreign concept. The real enemy wasn't the Allies, but the gnawing hunger in their bellies. Men were fighting for a dictator's ego, not for a cause they believed in. In quiet moments, they didn't talk of glory or victory. They spoke of their mother's pasta, of the local wine, of the girls they left behind. They were Italians, first and foremost, and this war felt like a distant, pointless fever dream, orchestrated by men in Rome who had never missed a meal. Before they even saw their first real battle, they were psychologically defeated. They had been fed a steady diet of propaganda about Italy's might and destiny, but the reality was a stark, pathetic contrast. The officers were often arrogant and incompetent, the supply lines were a mess, and the gnawing feeling that they were on the wrong side of history was impossible to shake. It wasn't an army of fanatics. It was an army of conscripts, of boys and men who would rather be tilling their fields or working in their shops. The grand speeches about national pride rang hollow when your boots had holes in them and your stomach was empty. This deep-seated disillusionment was the crack in the foundation of Mussolini's war machine, a crack that was about to shatter completely. The young soldier Marco from the industrial north was far more cynical. He saw the posters of Mussolini, chest puffed out, and scoffed. He knew the factories were struggling, that the country was poor, and that this entire adventure was doomed. He just hoped to survive it. His pragmatism would later prove to be an invaluable asset in a world turned upside down. The sense of impending doom was palpable. They were being sent to fight the industrial might of America and the British Empire with outdated weapons and an empty promise. It was a fool's errand. For many, like Giovanni and Marco, the goal wasn't to win the war, but simply to live through it. This desperation would soon lead to an unprecedented decision. When the moment of truth came, under the relentless African sun, with British tanks on the horizon and their water canteens long since empty, the choice became painfully simple: to fight and die for a cause they didn't believe in, or to surrender and face the unknown. For tens of thousands, the answer was obvious. Their war was already over in their hearts. Before we continue with the story, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more incredible true stories like this one, stories that change how you see history. Give this video a thumbs up if you're already hooked, and let us know in the comments which city and country you're watching from. It's amazing to see our community span the globe. The act of surrender was less a military defeat and more a collective sigh of relief. They dropped their rifles, raised their hands, and walked towards the enemy lines, stepping out of Mussolini's broken dream and into a new, terrifying reality. They were now prisoners of war, about to be shipped to the heart of the nation they were told was monstrous. The North African campaign was a meat grinder. The conditions were absolutely brutal. The scorching daytime sun gave way to bone-chilling nights, and the landscape was a monotonous expanse of sand and rock. For the Italian army, already poorly supplied, it was a logistical nightmare. Food was scarce, water was more precious than gold, and medical supplies were almost non-existent. It was a war of attrition they were destined to lose. With the well-supplied and highly mechanized British and American forces, entire Italian divisions began to collapse. The Battle of El Alamein was a turning point, but the surrenders that followed were less a single event and more a constant, flowing tide. Giovanni's unit held out for weeks on nothing but hard biscuits and gritty water until their commander, seeing the futility, raised the white flag. Giovanni, the moment of capture was surreal. He expected a rifle butt to the face, a scream of hatred. Instead, a British soldier offered him a cigarette and a canteen of clean water. It was his first taste of the enemy's humanity, a small gesture that completely contradicted the monstrous caricatures from the propaganda posters back home. It was confusing and, frankly, a massive relief. They weren't isolated incidents. All across the Tunisian and Libyan deserts, Italian soldiers were surrendering by the tens of thousands. They came walking out of the desert in long, dusty columns, hands in the air, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. For them, being captured wasn't a dishonor, it was a rational choice, a ticket out of a hellish existence. Allies were almost overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. They set up massive, sprawling holding pens in the desert. The logistics of feeding, housing, and processing nearly 500,000 prisoners were staggering. But for the captured Italians, even these rudimentary camps were an improvement. There was food, water, and most importantly, an end to the constant fear of dying for nothing. So, ever the observer noticed the efficiency of it all. The Allies had trucks, they had supplies, they had a system. It was a world away from the chaotic and crumbling Italian command structure he had just left. He saw the power of the enemy not in their tanks or planes, but in their ability to simply get things done. It was a sobering realization. Propaganda had told them that surrender was a fate worse than death. They had been warned of torture, of execution, of being worked to death in slave labor camps. Every story was designed to instill fear and force them to fight to the last man. But as they sat in the holding pens, the reality was just boredom. The expected brutality never materialized. Mass surrender created a unique population of prisoners. Unlike the more fanatical German soldiers, the vast majority of these Italians had no deep ideological commitment to fascism. They were just ordinary men caught in the gears of war. This distinction would become critically important, setting the stage for the unbelievable events that were about to unfold on American soil. The first part of the Desert War was over, but a new uncertainty loomed. They were herded from the holding pens towards the coast, where massive transport ships waited. Their destination was a mystery, but the rumors began to fly. They were going to Canada, to Britain, or to the most feared place of all, America itself. The journey was about to begin. They boarded the ships, leaving the shores of Africa behind. They left behind their lives as soldiers. They were now just numbers on a manifest, cargo being shipped across a vast ocean. The fear of the unknown was a heavy blanket. What kind of monsters awaited them in the belly of the beast? They were about to find out. The journey across the Atlantic was a harrowing experience in itself. Thousands of men were packed into the dark, cavernous holds of Liberty ships, vessels designed for cargo, not passengers. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, sea salt, and fear. For weeks, they were tossed about by the relentless ocean waves, a claustrophobic, disorienting ordeal that tested the sanity of every man aboard. The long days and nights at sea, their imaginations ran wild, fueled by years of fascist propaganda. They pictured America as a land of decadent, cruel capitalists who would exploit them for labor until they dropped. Marco listened to the fearful whispers around him. Some men were convinced they'd be sent to work in dangerous mines, others feared medical experiments. The truth was, nobody knew what to expect. Fear was a tangible thing in the belly of that ship. Every creak of the hull, every storm that rocked the vessel, felt like a prelude to doom. They were completely powerless, adrift in more ways than one. Giovanni would spend hours just staring at the sliver of sky, visible through a hatch, praying to a god he wasn't sure was listening anymore. He was just a boy, a world away from his home. To their terror was the constant threat of German U-boats. They were, after all, on Allied ships, making them a prime target. The irony was not lost on them. After surviving the battlefields of Africa, they could be sent to the bottom of the ocean by their own supposed allies. It was a grim lottery, and every day they survived felt like a small victory. American and British guards on the ships were a puzzle. They weren't the snarling brutes from the propaganda posters. They were professional, distant, and efficient. They handed out food rations, bland but filling, and mostly left the prisoners to their own devices. This lack of overt cruelty was, in its own way, unsettling. It didn't fit the narrative they had been sold their entire lives. Weeks dragged on, a strange sort of routine set in. The initial terror subsided into a dull, anxious monotony. The men would pass the time playing cards with makeshift decks, sharing stories of home, or simply sleeping to escape the reality of their situation. They were in a state of suspended animation, caught between a past that was destroyed and a future that was a terrifying blank. With his keen eye, noticed something else. He saw the sheer scale of the Allied operation. The convoy they were part of stretched for miles, a floating city of steel protected by warships. It was an awesome display of industrial and military power, a power that Mussolini's Italy could only dream of. The war, he realized, had been lost long before they ever fired a shot. One morning, a shout went up, "Land!" Men scrambled to portholes and hatches, desperate for a glimpse. Through the mist, they saw it, the faint outline of a coastline. They had arrived. The journey was over, but the real test was about to begin. They were about to set foot in America. The fear, once a dull ache, sharpened into a knife's edge. They were marched off the ship and onto the docks of Hampton Roads, Virginia. They blinked in the unfamiliar sunlight. They saw American dock workers, civilians, even children, staring at them with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. They were the enemy, now on display. Their minds braced for the worst as they were loaded onto trains, heading deep into the heart of the country. The train ride itself was another shock. Looking out the windows, they didn't see a desolate, struggling nation. They saw endless, bountiful farmland, bustling towns with automobiles, and a sense of normalcy that was jarring. This wasn't the collapsing capitalist society they'd been told about. This was something else entirely. Something powerful and prosperous. The confusion was beginning to mount. For a long train journey, Giovanni and his fellow prisoners arrived at their destination, Camp Atterbury, Indiana. As they marched through the gates, the first thing they noticed was the lack of grim, foreboding structures. Instead, they saw rows of tidy wooden barracks neatly arranged along paved streets. It looked less like a prison and more like a military base, a clean one. Second shock came when they were assigned their bunks. Each man got a cot with a mattress, a pillow, and 2 wool blankets. For men who had been sleeping on the hard desert ground or in the cramped hull of a ship for months, this simple comfort felt like an unimaginable luxury. Giovanni pressed his hand against the mattress, half expecting it to be a mirage. Came the processing. They were ordered to strip and were immediately taken to hot showers with soap. Clean clothes were issued. A medical officer gave each man a thorough examination, treating wounds, infections, and malnutrition. This wasn't the brutal neglect they had braced for. This was systematic professional care. It was profoundly disorienting. The cruelty they anticipated was nowhere to be found. Biggest shock of all was the mess hall. The prisoners shuffled into a large, clean building and were handed trays. Their eyes widened. On the trays were portions of beef stew, white bread with butter, mashed potatoes, and a steaming mug of coffee with real sugar. For dessert, there was a slice of apple pie. It was more food than they had seen in a year. Giovanni stared at his tray, completely dumbfounded. He thought it must be a trick, or perhaps their last meal before being executed. He watched the American guards, but they were just eating the same food, chatting casually. Hesitantly, he took a bite of the bread. It was soft and fresh. The coffee was hot and sweet. He ate slowly, savoring every mouthful, a wave of emotion washing over him. Though ever the cynic was suspicious. "They're fattening us up for something," he muttered to another prisoner. "No one treats their enemy this well for no reason." But as the days turned into weeks, and the 3 hot, plentiful meals a day continued without fail, his suspicion began to erode, replaced by a grudging respect. This wasn't a trick. This was just how things were. Treatment was dictated by the Geneva Convention, which the United States adhered to strictly. The rules stated that prisoners of war must be given the same rations as a nation's own base-level soldiers. Since American GIs ate well, the prisoners by law had to eat well too. It was a matter of principle and international law, but for the Italians, it felt like a miracle. Their abundance was staggering. They saw warehouses stocked high with food. They learned that things they considered rare luxuries, like coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes, were commonplace items available in a camp store called the PX. They were living better as prisoners in America than they had as free men and soldiers in Italy. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on them. Unexpected kindness was a powerful psychological weapon, though likely an unintentional one. It systematically dismantled the fascist propaganda they had been fed for years. The barbaric Americans were not monsters. They were organized, well-fed, and followed a code of conduct. This realization planted a seed of doubt that would soon blossom into something far more revolutionary. Prisoners began to gain weight. The haunted, gaunt look in their eyes was replaced by a healthier, more rested appearance. They were given work details around the camp, but the labor was reasonable, and the days were structured and predictable. For the first time in years, they felt safe, but just as they were settling into this bizarre new life, the world shifted on its axis once again. September 1943, monumental news crackled over the radio waves and spread like wildfire through the camps. Back in Europe, the political landscape had been completely upended. Benito Mussolini had been deposed, and the new Italian government, led by Marshal Badoglio, had officially surrendered to the Allies. The war between Italy and the Allied powers was over. It didn't stop there. In a stunning reversal, Italy then declared war on its former partner, Nazi Germany. Overnight, the nation of Italy went from being a core member of the Axis to a co-belligerent of the Allies. This single act of political realignment sent shockwaves across the globe, but nowhere was its impact more bizarrely felt than in the POW camps across America. The US government was faced with an unprecedented and thorny legal problem. What do you do with nearly 50,000 soldiers from a country that is no longer your enemy, but is now, technically, your ally? They were still prisoners of war under international law, but holding them as such felt politically awkward, to say the least. It was a bureaucratic and diplomatic nightmare. Prisoners like Giovanni and Marco, the news brought a wave of confusion and cautious optimism. Were they free? Could they go home? The camp commandants themselves didn't have answers. For a brief period, everything was in limbo. The men gathered in anxious groups, debating the possibilities, their future once again thrown into complete uncertainty. The American War Department scrambled to find a solution. They couldn't simply release 50,000 men onto American soil. That was a non-starter. Sending them back to Italy was also impossible. The country was now a war zone itself, with German forces occupying the north and Allied forces battling their way up the peninsula. Repatriation was a logistical and humanitarian impossibility. Political twist created a clear division within the prisoner population itself. While most, like Giovanni, were relieved that the fascist regime was gone, a small but vocal minority of hardcore fascists remained loyal to Mussolini, who had been rescued by the Germans and installed as the head of a puppet state in northern Italy. Tensions simmered within the camp fences. The US government needed a way to separate the cooperative majority from the fascist hardliners. They needed a way to utilize the manpower of the friendly Italians while keeping the true believers locked up. The situation was utterly without precedent in the history of modern warfare. A truly radical idea was needed to solve this unique problem. Shift in allegiance had a profound psychological effect. For years, they were the enemy. Now their homeland was fighting alongside the very men who were guarding them. It forced a re-evaluation of everything: their identity, their loyalty, and their role in the war. They were no longer just captured soldiers, they were representatives of a nation in turmoil. The solution that the US government eventually devised was as ingenious as it was controversial. It would not only change the lives of these thousands of Italian men forever, but would also give them a front-row seat to the American way of life, an experience that would prove to be more transformative than anyone could have ever imagined. A new chapter was about to begin. Men waited, their fate being decided in high-level meetings in Washington, D.C. The initial shock of Italy's surrender gave way to a tense anticipation. They were standing on the threshold of a new identity, about to be offered a choice that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. The enemy was about to be invited to join the team. A genius solution from Washington was the creation of the Italian Service Units, or ISUs. The proposition was simple. Italian prisoners of war would be given the opportunity to renounce fascism and pledge their support to the Allied cause. Those who agreed would be removed from the regular POW camps and granted a new, elevated status. It was a gamble, but a calculated one. It wasn't an offer of freedom, but it was the next best thing. Men who joined the ISUs would no longer be considered prisoners of war. Instead, they were classified as co-belligerents. They would be allowed to work under military supervision in non-combat roles across the country, helping the American war effort. It was an offer that was too good for most to refuse. Change in status came with some incredible perks. They would be paid for their labor, 80 cents a day, the same as an American private, a small fortune for men who had nothing. They were issued American military uniforms with a distinctive green patch on the sleeve that read Italy to distinguish them. They were, for all intents and purposes, part of the US Army. Giovanni jumped at the chance. For him, denouncing Mussolini was the easiest thing in the world. He had never believed in the cause anyway. The opportunity to leave the confines of the main camp, to earn money, and to wear a new uniform felt like a rebirth. He proudly signed the oath, feeling a sense of purpose for the first time in years. Though always more cautious, took a moment to weigh the options. He saw the strategic genius of the American plan. They were solving a labor shortage and a political headache in one fell swoop. He also saw the opportunity it presented. This was a ticket to see the real America, not just the inside of a prison camp. He signed his name right below Giovanni's. 80% of the Italian prisoners chose to join the ISUs. The fascist hardliners, a small but defiant minority, refused. They were segregated and sent to harsher camps in Texas and Arizona, where they would sit out the rest of the war under much stricter conditions. For them, the men joining the ISUs were traitors. The split was definitive and often bitter. Transformation was astonishing. One day they were POWs in drab, patched-up clothing. The next, they were marching in clean American uniforms, organized into companies and platoons. They were given significantly more freedom, allowed to move about their new, less secure bases, with far fewer restrictions. It was a whole new ballgame. Newly formed ISUs were then shipped out to military bases, depots and farms all across the United States. They were tasked with loading supplies, repairing equipment, working in laundries, and, most importantly, helping to harvest the crops that fed the nation and its armies abroad. They were about to become an integral, if unseen, part of the American war machine. The program was a massive, unprecedented experiment in trust. The US military was betting that these former enemies would honor their pledge. They were arming them not with guns, but with tools, and trusting them to work alongside American civilians and soldiers. It was a move that would have profound consequences, both for the war effort and for the men themselves. Giovanni and Marco boarded another train, this time not as shackled prisoners, but as uniformed members of an Allied unit. They felt a sense of surreal optimism. They were heading towards a new life, a new job, and a chance to experience the very country they had been sent to fight. The American experiment had begun. Men of the Italian service units being put to work was their window into the soul of America. Giovanni's unit was sent to a massive ordnance depot in Utah, where they loaded shells and supplies onto trains bound for the Pacific. The sheer scale of the operation was mind-boggling. Day and night, an endless river of material flowed through the depot. It was industry on a divine scale. Or firsthand the source of the Allied power he had witnessed in Africa. It wasn't just tanks and planes. It was the ability to produce, pack, and ship millions of tons of everything imaginable. He handled crates of food, uniforms, medical supplies, and ammunition. America, he realized, wasn't just a country. It was a colossal, unstoppable factory. His unit had a different, but equally eye-opening experience. They were sent to work on farms in the Midwest to help with the harvest, filling the labor gap left by American men who were away at war. It was here that he truly encountered the American dream. He worked on a family farm where the farmer drove a car, his house had electricity, and his children went to school. Compared to the near-feudal poverty of the tenant farmers in his native Italy, this was another universe. These American farmers owned their land. They used powerful tractors and harvesting machines. They weren't struggling for subsistence. They were producing a surplus of food so vast it could feed armies on the other side of the world. It was a revelation. Work was hard, but the rewards were immense and not just monetary. At the end of a long day in the fields, the farmer's wife would often bring out pitchers of lemonade or fresh milk and plates of sandwiches. This simple human kindness from their former enemies was a constant source of wonder. They were treated not as prisoners, but as valued helpers. It was through this work that they saw the fabric of American society up close. They saw the abundance of consumer goods in small-town shop windows. They saw the freedom and confidence of the people they worked alongside. It was a society built on an optimism and a sense of possibility that was completely alien to the fatalistic, class-bound world they came from. They began to pick up English, learning phrases from the American soldiers they worked with and the civilians they encountered. They started to understand American humor, listen to American radio programs, and even develop a taste for American foods like hamburgers and Coca-Cola. They weren't just observing America, they were slowly, unconsciously becoming a part of it. 80 cents a day they earned was more than just pocket money. It gave them a sense of dignity and autonomy. They could buy things at the post exchange, magazines, candy, and souvenirs to send home. For the first time, they felt a connection between their labor and its reward, a fundamental pillar of the American ethos. Immersion in the American heartland was a far more powerful form of re-education than any lecture or propaganda film could ever be. They weren't being told that the American way was better. They were living it. They were seeing with their own eyes the fruits of a democratic, capitalist society, and it was an incredibly persuasive argument. And itself was a source of awe. The vast, open spaces, the fertile soil, the sheer scale of the continent. For men from a small, ancient and crowded country, the endless horizon of the American Midwest was a powerful symbol of limitless opportunity. The seeds of an idea were being planted. Perhaps their future didn't lie back in Italy, but right here. Men of the ISUs were discovering America. Not all of America was happy to discover them. The program, though practical, was hugely controversial. Many Americans, their sons and husbands fighting and dying overseas, were outraged at the seemingly cushy treatment being given to former enemy soldiers on home soil. The sentiment was raw and understandable. Papers across the country ran sensationalist headlines about the Italian POW holiday camps. They printed stories, often exaggerated, of the prisoners eating steak and ice cream while honest Americans were dealing with wartime rationing. It painted a picture of the government coddling the enemy while its own citizens made sacrifices for the war effort. It was a public relations nightmare. To the editor poured into local papers, filled with fury. "My son is in a foxhole eating cold rations, and we're giving these fascists 3 hot meals a day," was a common refrain. The distinction between prisoner of war and co-belligerent was a legal subtlety lost on a grieving mother or a worried wife. To them, an enemy was an enemy. Politicians, never ones to miss an opportunity, seized on the controversy. Some accused the Roosevelt administration of being soft, of betraying the American people. Congressional inquiries were launched, and military officials were called to testify and defend the ISU program. The debate raged in the halls of power and on the front pages of newspapers. Public anger often translated into direct hostility towards the Italian men. When Marco's unit was transported to a new worksite, they were sometimes met with jeers and insults from civilians. People would shout, "Go back to where you came from," or make hostile gestures. It was a jarring reminder that despite their new uniforms, many still saw them as the enemy. Prejudice was particularly acute in communities with large numbers of Italian Americans. While some were sympathetic, others were fiercely patriotic and deeply ashamed of Mussolini's regime. They went to great lengths to prove their loyalty to America and saw the presence of these soldiers as a black mark on their community's reputation. It was a complex and tense dynamic. The American soldiers assigned to guard the ISUs were sometimes conflicted. One such guard, Sergeant Miller, was a tough-as-nails veteran who initially viewed his charges with deep suspicion. He had friends who had been killed by Italian troops in Africa. It was his job to supervise them, but trusting them was a whole other matter. Miller watched them work, expecting laziness or sabotage, but instead he saw diligence and a genuine eagerness to do a good job. He heard them talk, not of fascism, but of their families and their hopes for the future. Slowly, grudgingly, his perception began to shift. He started to see them not as a faceless enemy, but as individual men, much like the men in his own platoon. Tension between official policy and public opinion was a constant undercurrent. The ISU program was a pragmatic solution to a real problem, but it required a level of nuance that was difficult to communicate during the heated passion of a world war. The Italians were caught in the middle, beneficiaries of a progressive policy, but also targets of public scorn. Despite the hostility, the program continued because it was simply too valuable to scrap. The labor provided by the nearly 45,000 men in the ISUs was critical to the war economy. They were working on docks, in warehouses, on farms, and at military depots, freeing up American soldiers for combat duty. They had become a vital, if controversial, part of the home front. The ISU members gained more freedom. Their interactions with local American communities became more frequent and personal. They were often taken into nearby towns under supervision to watch movies or attend church services. It was during these chaperoned outings that the rigid lines between enemy and friend began to blur in the most human way imaginable. Small farming towns of the Midwest and the rural communities of the South, these Italian men, with their charming accents and continental manners, were an exotic presence. Many local American women, their own men away at war, were intrigued. What started as curious glances across a church hall or a polite conversation at a town social sometimes blossomed into something more. Friendships formed first. Giovanni, who was working on a farm in Virginia, struck up a bond with the farmer's family. He would play with their children in the evenings and help the farmer's wife, a woman named Eleanor, with her garden. They would share stories, he of his village in Sicily, she of her husband fighting in the Pacific. A deep platonic affection grew between them. Others, these connections turned romantic. Despite strict non-fraternization rules, love found a way. Secret meetings were arranged, letters were passed through sympathetic friends. These were forbidden romances, fraught with risk for both the Italian man and the American woman. If discovered, he could be sent back to a harsh POW camp, and she could be branded a traitor by her community. Relationships were a testament to the power of human connection to overcome the barriers of war and politics. An American woman who fell for an Italian ISU member wasn't falling for the enemy. She was falling for a person, for his sense of humor, his kindness, or the sadness she saw in his eyes. They saw the man, not the uniform he used to wear. I witnessed one such romance unfold in his unit. A fellow ISU member named Luca fell deeply in love with a local librarian. They would meet in secret in the woods near the camp. Marco worried for his friend, but he also understood. In a world defined by chaos and death, finding a moment of love and connection felt like the ultimate act of defiance. Interactions, whether friendships or romances, were transformative for the Italian men. They were being welcomed into the heart of American life, the family dinner table, the town dance, the Sunday picnic. This was an intimacy with the American dream that went far beyond observing it from a distance. They were being treated like family, like they belonged. Of course, these relationships also fueled the public controversy. The idea of American women consorting with former enemies was scandalous to many and provided more fodder for the sensationalist press. But for the individuals involved, it wasn't a political act. It was a simple matter of the heart, a bright spot of warmth in the cold shadow of a global conflict. Bonds forged during this time would prove to be incredibly durable. Many of these couples would promise to reunite after the war, a promise that seemed almost impossible to keep. These relationships became a powerful anchor, another compelling reason why, when the time came, leaving America would feel less like a liberation and more like an exile. Personal connections completed the psychological transformation that had begun with the first hot meal at Camp Atterbury. The men had been shown systematic kindness by an institution, the U.S. Army, but now they were experiencing personal kindness and even love from individual Americans. The country was no longer an abstract concept. It was the face of Eleanor, the librarian, the farmer, and his family. The men of the ISU were experiencing a life of relative safety, abundance, and newfound personal connections. A steady stream of letters from their families in Italy painted a starkly different picture. The mail, often delayed for months and heavily censored, was their only link to the world they had left behind, and the news it carried was almost uniformly grim. Gianni would wait anxiously for letters from his mother. When they finally arrived, the pages told a story of horror. His village, once a peaceful haven, was now caught in the crossfire. Allied bombing raids targeted nearby roads and bridges, and the retreating German army looted farms for food, leaving civilians to starve. His family was living in constant fear. Letters described a country tearing itself apart. After Italy's surrender, a brutal civil war erupted. In the north, Mussolini's puppet state, backed by the Nazis, hunted down anti-fascist partisans. In the south, the Allied advance was slow and bloody, turning towns and cities into rubble. There was no safe place. Hunger was rampant, and society was collapsing. He read letters from his sister in Milan that spoke of unimaginable hardship. She wrote about the daily struggle to find bread, the constant wail of air raid sirens, and the public executions of suspected resistance fighters. The vibrant city, he remembered, was now a grey, terrified ghost of its former self, a place of starvation and paranoia. Contrast between their own situation and that of their families was a heavy, gut-wrenching burden. Here they were in America with 3 warm meals a day, clean beds and personal safety, while their loved ones were facing bombs, starvation and civil war. The guilt was immense. They would read their letters in silence, their faces etched with worry and sorrow. Devastating news from home profoundly shifted their perspective. The romantic, nostalgic image of Italy they held in their hearts was shattered by the brutal reality described in the letters. Home was no longer a place of comfort and safety to long for. It had become a hellscape of destruction and suffering, a place they dreaded returning to. America they were now living in, a country untouched by bombs and blessed with unimaginable abundance, started to look less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. It was a land of peace and order in a world gone mad. The simple normalcy of American life, people going to work, kids playing in the streets, was a miracle compared to the chaos engulfing their homeland. Psychological disconnect was a crucial turning point. The natural human instinct to yearn for home was being overridden by the rational fear of what home had become. Why would anyone choose to return to a life of poverty, danger, and political instability when they were currently living in a place that offered security and opportunity? It has also made them realize how lucky they had been to be captured. Their friends who had kept fighting were either dead, wounded, or now trapped in the horrific fighting on the Italian peninsula. By surrendering, they had inadvertently won a lottery ticket to survival and, as they were now discovering, to a potentially better life. As they worked on American farms and in American depots, their minds were torn. They loved their families and worried for them constantly, but the idea of returning to Italy filled them with a deep and paralyzing dread. The golden cage of their captivity was starting to feel a lot more like a golden door of opportunity. May 1945, the news they had all been waiting for finally arrived. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. Victory bells rang out across America, and a wave of euphoric relief swept the nation. For the men of the Italian service units, the news was met with a far more complex and muted reaction. Their war had been over for years, but this was different. This was the true end. Official announcement came down from the camp commanders. With the cessation of hostilities, the ISU program would be phased out. The legal justification for their presence on U.S. soil was ending. The process of repatriation would begin soon. They were finally going to be sent home. They were free. The American guards, like Sergeant Miller, it was a moment of profound relief. The long, brutal war was over. The job was done. He looked at the faces of the Italian men he had supervised for nearly 2 years, men he had come to know and, in some cases, even respect, and assumed they would be celebrating. He expected cheers, songs, and tears of joy. Reaction in the barracks was not what he or anyone else expected. There were no jubilant celebrations. Instead, a heavy, anxious silence fell over the men. They looked at each other not with joy, but with wide-eyed panic. The news of freedom sounded less like a promise and more like a death sentence. Arnie's heart sank. Go home. Go back to what? The last letter from his mother had spoken of a destroyed village, a ruined farm, and a future with no prospects. Here, he had a purpose. He had safety. He had friends. He had even started saving a little money. Returning to Italy meant returning to rubble and poverty. The thought terrified him. Joe, always the pragmatist, saw the situation in stark, logical terms. America was a nation on the rise, victorious and prosperous. Italy was a nation in ruins, defeated, bankrupt, and politically volatile. To leave the former for the latter seemed like an act of insanity. It was a step backward into the darkness they had been so lucky to escape. Men gathered in small, frantic groups, their conversations filled with dread. What will we do there? There is no work. Our homes are gone. The dream of returning to a welcoming, familiar homeland had long since been replaced by the nightmare reality they knew was waiting for them. They had seen a better life, and now it was being taken away. Pending departure also meant saying goodbye to the personal connections they had forged. The friendships with American soldiers, the bonds with local families, and for some, the secret romances that had blossomed in the shadow of the war. Leaving America meant leaving behind people they had come to care for deeply, perhaps never to see them again. Irony was almost too much to bear. For years, as prisoners, their every moment had been controlled. Now they were being given the ultimate freedom, the freedom to go home, and it was the one thing they didn't want. Their prison had, through a bizarre twist of fate, become their sanctuary, and the prospect of leaving it was devastating. The US military began the massive logistical preparations for repatriating hundreds of thousands of prisoners from all over the country. A quiet, desperate rebellion began to stir within the Italian service units. These men, who had followed every order, were about to make a final, shocking request that would catch an entire nation completely by surprise. First ships were being prepared for the journey back to Europe. The unbelievable happened. It started not as a riot or a protest, but as a series of formal, desperate pleas. Thousands of members of the Italian service units began to actively refuse repatriation. They didn't want to go home. They wanted to stay in America. Camps across the country, men like Giovanni and Marco approached their commanding officers. They wrote letters, they drafted petitions, they begged and pleaded with anyone who would listen. Their message was simple and astounding. Please, let us stay. It was a request so contrary to the very nature of a prisoner of war that it left the American authorities completely baffled. Asked for their reasons, the men gave a variety of answers. Some spoke of the economic devastation in Italy, the lack of jobs, the destroyed infrastructure. Others spoke of the political instability and the fear of renewed conflict. But the reason that was easiest to grasp, the one that reporters latched onto, was the simplest of all. The food is better here. The phrase, "the food is better," became a famous, almost comical shorthand for a much deeper and more complex reality. It wasn't just about the food. It was a symbol for everything they had experienced: the safety, the dignity, the opportunity, the kindness, the glimpse of a future that was not defined by poverty and war. It was about a better life. The American public was stunned. The story was picked up by newspapers and radio broadcasts nationwide. The same people who had been outraged by the coddling of the prisoners were now faced with the bizarre spectacle of those same prisoners begging not to leave. It was a shocking and powerful testament to the allure of the American dream, even when viewed from behind a fence. The situation put the War Department in an incredibly awkward position. On one hand, it was a massive propaganda victory. The former enemy had seen America and deemed it so superior to their own country that they refused to leave. It was the ultimate validation of the American way of life. But on the other hand, it was a logistical and legal nightmare. Miller couldn't believe his ears. The men he had once viewed as the enemy were now literally petitioning him to remain in his country. He saw the genuine fear in their eyes. He had seen their work ethic, he had heard their stories, and he understood. He felt a strange pang of sympathy for them, caught between a broken past and an inaccessible future. These became more organized. The men pooled their money to hire lawyers. They wrote letters to members of Congress, to the President, even to the Pope, asking for intervention. They argued that they had served the Allied cause faithfully in the ISUs and deserved to be given a chance to build a new life as immigrants. Their efforts, however heartfelt, were running up against a wall of international law and bureaucratic inertia. The Geneva Convention was clear. At the end of hostilities, prisoners of war must be repatriated to their country of origin. There was no provision for them to simply stay. They were soldiers of the Italian army, and to Italy they must return. The climax of the story reveals the profound transformation these men had undergone. They had arrived as defeated soldiers of a fascist dictatorship, expecting brutality. Instead, they were met with a structured kindness that slowly dismantled their worldview. They had worked and lived in the heartland of their enemy, and in the process had fallen in love with it. Despite the petitions, the legal challenges, and the heartfelt pleas, the decision from Washington was final and unyielding. International law was absolute. The men of the Italian service units would be sent home whether they liked it or not. The great machine of military bureaucracy, having brought them to America, was now configured to send them back. Final days in the camps were filled with a profound sadness. The men began packing their meager belongings, a process that felt more like preparing for an exile than a homecoming. They were given their final pay and new civilian clothes to wear on the journey. The mood was somber, like a funeral. The dream was over. Scenes of departure were bittersweet and emotional. At train stations and on the docks, the Italians said their goodbyes to the American soldiers who had been their guards, supervisors, and, in many cases, their friends. Men like Sergeant Miller, who had once viewed them with suspicion, now found themselves shaking hands and wishing them well with genuine sincerity. Those who had formed deeper connections, the farewells were heartbreaking. At the fences of the camps, local American women, their eyes filled with tears, came to say goodbye to the men they had befriended or fallen in love with. Promises were made to write, to stay in touch, to find a way to reunite one day. Promises whispered against a backdrop of military orders and ship horns. Johnny had to say goodbye to Eleanor and her family. They gave him a small package with bread and cheese for the journey and a photograph of themselves to remember them by. Eleanor's quiet, "Godspeed, Giovanni," was one of the hardest things he had ever had to hear. He was leaving a place where he had felt more at home than he ever had in his own country. Marco boarded the ship. He looked back at the skyline of New York City. He had spent 2 years in the United States, and it had fundamentally changed him. He had seen what was possible, the potential for a life of dignity and hard-won prosperity. He vowed to himself that this would not be the last time he saw this land. This was not an ending, but a new beginning. The journey back across the Atlantic was the mirror opposite of the one that had brought them. The fear of the unknown was gone, replaced by the certainty of the hardship that awaited them. They were no longer afraid of what America was, but of what Italy had become. The mood in the ship's hold was one of quiet, shared resignation. The U.S. government tried to ease their transition. They were allowed to take their savings with them, and each man was given a letter of commendation for his service in the ISU, a document that might help them in the chaotic post-war Italian bureaucracy. But these were small comforts against the tide of uncertainty they were sailing into. The shores of Italy came into view. The men crowded the decks. They saw the scars of war etched into their homeland, bombed-out buildings, sunken ships in the harbors. This was the reality they had been dreading. They were home, but it was a home that was broken, impoverished, and utterly alien to the place they had left behind. They disembarked, not as returning heroes, but as a logistical problem for a new and fragile Italian government. They were processed and sent on their way, back to villages and cities that were struggling to rebuild. The American chapter of their lives was officially closed, or so it seemed. Most stories, the repatriation would be the end, but for thousands of these Italian men, it was merely an intermission. The years immediately following the war in Italy were just as difficult as they had feared. The economy was in shambles, jobs were non-existent, and political instability was rampant. The comfortable, orderly life they had known in America felt like a distant dream. They hadn't just brought back savings and souvenirs from the United States. They had brought back something far more valuable, connections and a burning ambition. They had addresses of American friends, former employers, and the women they had fallen in love with, and they had a deep, unshakable desire to return. Johnny struggled for years on his family's ruined farm. Every day was a battle for survival. He never stopped writing to Eleanor, and she wrote back, her letters a lifeline to the world he longed for. With her help and the formal sponsorship of the farmer she worked for, Giovanni began the long, arduous process of applying for legal immigration to the United States. He wasn't the only one. A surprising number of former ISU members began leveraging the connections they had made. They navigated the complex immigration laws of the late 1940s and 1950s, a process that often took years of patient paperwork and waiting. They were driven by the memory of what they had seen and the promise of a better life. So, with his pragmatic mind, used his savings to start a small business in Milan, but he never took his eyes off the ultimate prize. He corresponded with a U.S. Army officer he had impressed with his work ethic, and that officer eventually sponsored his immigration visa. Marco sold his business and bought a one-way ticket to America. Across the United States, a quiet and remarkable reunion began to take place. These men, who had first arrived as prisoners in military uniforms, were now returning as free men, as immigrants, their cardboard suitcases filled with hope. They were coming back to the towns where they had worked, to the people who had shown them kindness. Many of the wartime romances were rekindled. Men crossed an ocean to reunite with the American women they had never forgotten. They got married, started families, and raised their children as Americans. The forbidden love that had blossomed in the shadow of war became the foundation of new multicultural families. Returning Italians were uniquely equipped to succeed. They already spoke some English, understood American culture and work ethic, and were not afraid of hard labor. They assimilated quickly, becoming mechanics, builders, restaurateurs, and small business owners. They became a part of the fabric of the communities that had once held them captive. Final, impactful chapter of the story is a testament to their incredible perseverance. They had seen the American dream through the most unlikely of windows, a POW camp, and had spent years fighting to get back to it. Their journey shows that the definition of home is not always about where you were born, but where you find opportunity, dignity, and a future. Returned not as the enemy, but as some of the most ardent and grateful new citizens the country could ask for. Their story, which began with a surrender in the African desert, ended with the fulfillment of a promise they made to themselves, to return to the land that had imprisoned their bodies but had ultimately liberated their spirits. The story of the Italian prisoners of war is one of the most profound ironies of the Second World War. They were brought to America as enemies to be punished, but through a strange combination of international law, political necessity, and basic human decency, they discovered a new life. The infamous phrase, "the food is better," was never just about what was on their plate. It was a symbol for dignity, for peace, and for the astonishing opportunity they witnessed in a nation they were supposed to hate. Their experience teaches us that even in the midst of the most brutal global conflict, our shared humanity can flourish in the most unexpected of places, breaking down the very definition of friend and enemy. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through history. What part of this story surprised you the most? Was it the initial luxury treatment they received, or their desperate plea to stay at the end? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love reading your perspectives. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a forgotten chapter of World War II, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. It truly helps us bring more of these hidden histories to light for you and ensures you won't miss our next video. Every click makes a huge difference for our community. Prison, in a strange and beautiful way, became their ultimate freedom, and the enemy, against all odds, finally found a home. We appreciate every single one of you for watching. Until the next story, take care.